Hey, what's up everybody? This is Steven Robot. We're back continuing on with the P200 restoration. We're at Vespa Motorsport, Scooter Weiss in San Diego, California. You can see Robot had a little bit of spare time amongst running the repair shop today. Amongst juggling 10,000 other things and 3 full-time mechanics, he had time to get started on pulling the cables, pulling the harness, starting to install some of the trim stuff. And again, like we said in the intro, we're gonna try and say this on just about every bit, but it's all about the order of operations, and we're gonna stress the order of operations throughout this project. Robot and I have combined probably done this well over 100 times. So it's one thing we may know is we definitely know what should be done and when it should be done. Wouldn't you agree, Robot?
Yep.
So without much further ado, we're gonna kind of cut in and do some close-ups, and Robot's gonna start talking about what he's done today and in what order, and we're gonna give you all sorts of tips. So at home, this will be a breeze.
All right, so pretty much I went ahead and put all the cables in, the wiring harness, which is kind of one of the more difficult tasks to do, and I'll give you some tips on that. Some of the trim pieces, as you see, the floor mat, little hooks, pretty much all the frame grommets are in on both sides. Kind of see underneath there's a grommet under here for the rear brake clutch cable. Some of the electrical items, well, the 2 electrical items, the flasher and the regulator. And Steve actually has gone ahead and put the floor strips, which is actually quite a difficult task if you've never done it before, but he'll give you some tips on that. And that's about it.
So we're gonna bring the camera in close, and we're gonna start first and foremost talk about the first thing Robot did, which was to pull this harness in. So check back in a sec.
All right, so I'm gonna give you some tips on putting the wiring harness in. Pretty much this frame didn't have any of the other trim pieces on. I put all the rubber grommets in place, and there's rubber grommets for the taillight wiring back here. There's a grommet here for the wiring that passes to the voltage regulator, battery, and the flasher. You see this little metal tab that actually secures the wiring harness. It's been folded over. It's like the original tab from the frame. And there's also some connections that I did a little bit later, but they're for the actual rear turn signal connections, and these are little pegs that the cowl pins make contacts to for the connection. And then also right here and right here, the cowl hooks, there's actually 2 ground straps that go to them, the 2 black wires. Very important that those are grounded, because it's pretty tricky to get the rear turn signals working on these, but it's critical to get these 4 connections correct.
And stepping back a little bit on those body grommets, those are just kind of generic, basically body grommets. We don't actually have those ones by part number, but if you even go to a place like Harbor Freight, you can buy those cheap body grommet sets, and stuff like that is kind of handy to have around. But for the most part, all the model-specific body grommets that Robot will get to in a bit is actually out of either a rubber kit, or we also sell all those items a la carte. Sorry, Robot.
Oh, no problem. You have to know where things lead. I mean, if you took the bike apart, you kind of know. You know, I've taken a number of these apart. Like you got the 4 3/16 or the 5 3/16 little connections here. You know, that obviously goes to the engine junction box. This would be your neutral switch. And if you have the wiring diagram, if you've put one of these together for the first time, you can kind of trace where the wires go. You know, lay out the harness before you install it. Maybe mark it with some masking tape. You know, neutral light. You know, the stator plate junction. You got your tail light wiring right here, and the wiring that goes to the regulator. And then there's a long section of the thick harness that actually runs towards the front. Everybody's kind of wondering probably which direction you run it. The wiring harnesses on these American P200s is rather thick in some areas, so it can be quite a bear to run through. But basically, you push it from in here, and as you can see, you can't really do this unless you have the brake pedal out and the fork out, because some of the wiring you actually kind of stick your finger in here, you know, to help feed the wiring through. These 2 wires actually make connection to the rear brake switch. Basically, I'd use a fish tape. I don't have one.
Fish tape or a wire?
Yeah, a wire. You could use a rope, something like that. Use some electrical tape, tape it to the bulk of the harness, you know, that goes towards the front. And ideally, you'd pull all of the whole entire harness, including this piece, through this left-hand side right here, obviously without the fork. So you can see I've left some of the wires coming out here. This is your horn wiring. This is your front junction box wiring, which actually has wires that lead to your control switches on the left and right handlebars. And this is the trickiest section to get through, actually. But you can see it's actually behind the actual lock. You know, the lock actually goes right down here. And the way to get this up through, you know, you can't get this whole mess through that little slot right there. Basically, is what I'll do is I'll kind of fold most of these back and hook the fish tape to just this ground wire and basically pull it from the front horn cover kind of area up through this, and you'll get some of the terminals. You can get a little needle nose and just pull each one of these terminals one by one through, you know, and work on not getting them wadded up, and then you could pull the rest of it through.
I don't know, one thing that makes it a little bit easier is we've already got the upper steering race installed, but obviously this bike came back from the painter with that race removed. It's actually easier to pull that harness through without that race in place.
That's correct. Yeah, I didn't have this race in place. You know,
and that race just hammers in. It's pretty simple, straightforward.
Pretty simple.
But that little bit of space makes it that much easier.
And the last of the wiring up front is your turn signal, the front turn signal wiring. These grommets that are in the frame, they're kind of up high, kind of hard to get to. Ideally, the easiest way to get the wires through would be to fold that over and kind of make like a little hook. And you could actually sight right down that tube and kind of feed it up from that side and then poke it through and hook it with some type of hook and then pull the wire through the grommet. You know, versus trying to fish this terminal, it's going to be nearly impossible trying to fish that terminal through that grommet. And as you can see, your left side's going to be the brown, right side's going to be your blue wire. The same actually with the connections at the cowl contacts. And that pretty much does it for the wiring harness. As you can see, there's specific places this comes through. This comes through on this right-hand side behind this lock right here.
And again, when Robot pulled this through, the wiring was the first thing he pulled through, and the key thing is starting from the back inside the tunnel here, and you kind of pull it through in phases. Start here, then you have access at the brake pedal, and then you've got access at the horn cover, and you can finish it off. So it's kind of like 4 steps of massaging the thing into the frame.
Yeah, and it needs to be fished. And the way you set a fish to pull this harness through would be you want to push something through here, you know, like the stiff wire, like the fish tape, or you can actually even use a control cable. Obviously, don't want to yank these too much and ruin them, but you can go this way because it's really difficult to poke any of the control cables from this direction, because right past where the rear brake pedal, there's like kind of like a little metal dam that, you know, it's not this full cavity that's open. It's a thin cavity. It's about, you know, yay big, 3/4 inch high. So, you know, a lot of stuff gets kind of hung up on that, especially the bulk of the wiring harness. All right, so that pretty much says it for the wiring, you know, running the wiring harness. You kind of see everything. Next, we'll talk about the control cables.
All right, so we just covered installing the wiring harness. Next thing you want to do in the correct order of operations, and again, that is critical, would be to actually install the control cables. Control cables are actually a lot easier to install than you might think. We have a lot of people calling in on the phones thinking it's a monumental task to actually get these installed. When a bike is in this condition, it's extremely easy. All the control cables, your throttle, clutch, and the 2 selector cables, everything feeds from the top down, and kind of start pushing it through, and if it gets hung up here, you can actually reach in there with your fingers and push it down. Same thing if it actually starts to poke through where the access is for the rear brake, you can kind of reach in there and you'll see the cables and you can kind of continue to guide them in the correct direction. And you basically want to guide them into the void where the tank goes, and then once they're in there, you're pretty much, you know, got the job completed. Then you just want to direct them through the correct body grommets. So maybe we'll start down here, and we've got the 2 selector cables. Those want to poke through, and they poke through that special body grommet there. There's one thing that is always missing, and Robot's going to go ahead and install that right now. But there's supposed to be actually this protective sheeting that covers the 2 selector cables, and that basically shields those cables from, you know, the close proximity of the exhaust header, and it also acts as a bit of a buffer as it fits, you know, inside that little bracket that holds the selector cables.
And one other thing is, you know, if you're not familiar with the cables, you know, this is the complete Vespa P200 cable set. The two shift cables are same length, and you can see they have these small barrels and kind of a medium thickness of cable to them. So that's your shift cables. The clutch cable is going to be your longest, one of your longest housings, and it's going to have this larger barrel with a little bit thicker control cable. And the actual throttle cable is going to be your thinnest, and has a barrel, and on the other end there's a soldered on nipple. That's why I can't pull this cable through. All these other ones, you know, I could pull the cable all the way out. When I'm feeding them through, obviously I don't really have those all the way pulled in there because the actual ends of the cables kind of hang up on stuff, but I just, you know, pushed them all back in just for now.
Notice back up here on the handlebars, the actual where each cable passes through. The throttle cable goes between the wiring. It goes between the wiring and the knuckle for the steering column lock. It's pretty critical. We've seen countless times where people, you know, find it easier to run it through from the front side of the column lock. That's a major no-no. So you want the electrical and this cable behind that. And then on this side, when you think about the position of the handlebars, the shift cables are in front and then the clutch cables in back. And actually, if you're taking the thing apart, you probably notice there's a special brass clamp that was on these selector cables. It's not really a critical thing. It's not really available as a spare part. This is something that I've always liked to do. I don't know if Robot necessarily endorses this, but you can take a piece of 3/8 shrink tubing and kind of run that, I don't know, about 6 inches down the cables and kind of hold those cables at the same level, and you can actually heat that up, and that'll basically keep these things locked together and keep one from dropping or one from pulling up, which makes it easy when you go to reinstall everything.
The heat shrink works really good, or just you know, a couple layers of electrical tape, just something to keep them.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Shrink tubing's kind of clean. So I'm going to go ahead and do that while Robot talks about what's going on the other end. I don't know how to turn that thing on.
There you go. There's the crack torch.
The Richard Pryor torch. Yeah. So you see just kind of heating that up, shrinks down on the cables, holds them all in place all nice. Whoops, a little toasty. But you can kind of see now these cables aren't going to move. You know, they're going to be basically locked together. So they're not going to move independent of each other, which will be handy when it comes time to put the thing together. Robot's going to do the same. He's going to put that on the protective sheathing down on the other end like we talked about.
Yeah, this sheathing actually is a part number. It's like
The part number on that is a 090541. Can't tell you how often this is missing from bikes that we see.
I'm just putting a little, you know, some type of light lubricant on it, kind of in it, and then also on the end. I'll pull some of this through. I'll kind of actually pull more than I need. Obviously, don't want to pull so much that it drops all the way through, but
a little bit of lube is critical to get this done. And you see Robot's going to pass it through that rubber grommet.
And there's a little bit of lube on that because this is where it gets a little difficult, is pushing it through this grommet right there. But there it is. And obviously, when I get the motor in there, I'm, you know, able to pull more or less of the sheathing in there. But normally it's about that length, somewhere in that range. I'll fine tune that once I get the motor in.
And while John's down here, you notice all the body grommets and such. A lot of times after you come back from paint, it's good to use a tool like this one here. This is a reamer. See if that thing autofocuses. A couple different sizes of these. These are a nice thing to kind of have, especially when it comes time for restoration like this. Just to kind of carefully clean the paint out of those holes so those body grommets push back in effortlessly. While we're down on the body grommets, I guess we can kind of talk about the other cables where they poke through and how critical it is to put these things in the right spot. I can't tell you how many times Robot and I have seen bikes where people just completely blow this step and put stuff in the wrong holes. So what's going on down there, Robot? Talk about each one and
this
and
is
where it comes through.
your throttle cable, your choke cable, which I don't have hooked up on the actual choke thing. I'll show you a tip on installing that. One thing is kind of a lot of cables going through this, so you're gonna need to again spray some type of light lubricant on it, you know, to pass each one of these individually through. Obviously I got the wires through first, that's the most important one. Then you could kind of push these stiffer cables through, you know, after the fact. So one thing on this the choke cable, I see it almost all the, I don't know, quite often, is this little ferrule is actually rusted in the actual tube right here. And basically the problem with that is if I try to put this in, it won't seat all the way, and the cable, you won't be able to put the cable all the way through the hook, the choke knob on. Usually is what I do. Let's see where the
What you
torch
need.
is.
See if that helps. Torch.
Uh-huh. You know, basically, I'm just going to take the little ferrule off. Oops, don't need that.
Sorry.
I'll just do it off to this side. But
So you're taking that off and you're doing that by just kind of heating it up?
yeah, heating it up, and basically heating it up kind of softens up the actual plastic outer of the cable housing. It pulls right off pretty simple. You know, whatever goo is on there, you can clean off with whatever. It's not all that hot, but so you can see the coil of the actual control cable itself. And now I'll be able to feed this through. Probably won't be able to see too well where I'm feeding it, but basically this little tube has a ferrule that's already rusted in there that, you know, shouldn't be in there, but it's.
They're virtually impossible to remove those.
So now it's popped through, and you can see it will seat all the way in there. And if I push the control cable, see how it's just pulling through just a little bit right there? Now I can actually hook that onto the choke knob itself. And one last thing about this choke, see it missing all the time. It drives me absolutely nuts when a scooter doesn't have this little clip in place. This clip's in place. We actually end up painting it. It's no big deal if it is painted. But there's actually a little slot cut in the top of this tube. And that clip, the flat spot of that little clip actually drops onto that. And underneath is like a little piece of sheet metal that the clip actually pries over to give it some spring tension. And so what that does is it kind of holds the choke knob out. You know, when you pull it out, it will stay out. You know, won't return.
And the technique for installing that clip is kind of tricky. You obviously have to have the choke knob out. I've always had best luck if you go straight down, like at a, you know, from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock straight down, and you actually rotate it counterclockwise, I guess that would be.
Yeah, something like that.
Counterclockwise,
Yeah.
and it kind of hooks that little bottom tab he's talking about and locks in place, and you're good to go from there.
All right.
And I guess the other cables we could talk about, just to kind of show where they poke through, would be the clutch and rear brake. So that's on the underside here. So we'll rotate the frame up one more time, have John cruise in, and you can kind of see they pass through this grommet here. The part number on that grommet is 070286, 070286, and that's the rear brake, the fatter one, and the clutch one's the thinner one. What else? I think that's pretty much it for
That pretty much sums it up.
control cables. And obviously, once we kind of go further along in assembly, we'll show you the attaching them at the handlebars and at the motor and everything. So we'll cut and then move on to the next thing we're going to talk about, which will be installing the floor rails, I guess, right?
Yep.
All right, stay tuned. All right, so we're at this point where it's the ideal time to install the floor rails. I like to do it at this point because it's nice to be able to tilt the frame on its side so you can kind of move the frame around at any point in time or any direction so you can actually get underneath the frame. First thing we'll talk about is on this particular bike, we were fortunate enough to be able to reuse the original floor rails. I can't stress enough, if you have the opportunity to reuse your floor rails and they're not too twisted and mangled and nasty, absolutely do so. There's replacement kits that are complete with the aluminum channels, the rubber, the end pieces, the rivets, everything you'll need for just about every model of vintage Vespa. But I will tell you, those kits are an absolute struggle. If you make the mistake of not dry fitting them before you get the bike back from paint, you're going to be hating yourself, and you're going to be in for a long and frustrating night in the garage trying to get them installed. And the thing about these things, and people don't realize this, is not only do they curve up, but as they curve up, they actually twist. So I don't know if John can kind of see that, but you can kind of see how it's curved. So it curves up and then it twists to match this complex concave or convex, I don't know what that is, that curve of the leg shield. So again, we were very fortunate on these ones to have been able to just reuse them. So we've taken them off, we've cleaned all the grease off of them. This is one that we've hit quickly with like a Scotch-Brite pad. You can kind of see how clean it is. And in comparison to this other one that still is kind of a duller finish, it's still got black overspray on it from the way this bike was pretty crappily spray painted and such. So all you have to do with these things is grab a piece of Scotch-Brite pad and very quickly just kind of sand that. You can kind of see it just takes that paint off and it kind of gives it a nice little shine. These are aluminum, so if you really wanted to do like kind of more of a chromey style of restoration, you can actually take these over to the buffing and polishing wheel And you can actually polish these things and make them look like chrome. So we're gonna go ahead and finish prepping that before we install this right side. Kind of cheated and already did the left side. What we usually use to prep the holes is a nice clean like 1/8 inch drill bit. All we kind of do is go along and just clean out whatever paint is in there. This will make it so our rivets will pass through cleanly and easily. And also when we go to pass the rivets through, we won't be chipping the paint because we won't be fighting any of that residual paint buildup that's in the holes. So go along and drill out all those holes. And then we're actually going to start showing you a couple techniques for installing them.
All right, while Steve is prepping the floor rails for the right side, I'll go over some of the other electrical stuff I've installed, you know, kind of at this time. The voltage regulator is back in place. Basically, there's two variations on these American P200s. They kind of refer to the earlier ones as a double yellow, found on like the 78, you know, 79 Vespa, P200s, P125s. And then there's the yellow red, which is found on the 8081. The later one makes a little bit more power, and the regulator actually regulates the power to the headlight. This earlier one does not regulate the power to the headlight. But basically, you can see all the wire colors line up to this label that may or may not be on your regulator. I cleaned the threads where this ground connection is made. You can see this black ground connection made right there. Kind of tuck the wiring through here. And then there's the flasher under here. And there's 3 terminals on that flasher. I think there's a X, a L, and a P. The X is actually the power coming into it, and it's going to be a white with a green stripe. The L goes to your lamps, you know, it goes up to the actual turn signal switch, and that's going to be a solid white wire. And then also there's the, I think it's called P, which is like the actual little indicator, or so it's just the 3rd connection. I think it's the center connection. And that wire normally is white with a red stripe. I think on this harness it was like red with a yellow stripe, but you know, it basically leads to this small terminal that actually goes to the idiot light that's on the actual near the speedometer. But that's the one that goes to that 3rd connection on this thermal flasher right here. One thing to keep in mind whenever you get a wiring harness, it does not include this little lead that goes from your fuse holder to the battery. The fuse holder is no longer available from Vespa, the one where the actual terminal's plugged into it. A lot of times they're really rusty. This is a better fuse holder, it's a little bit better sealed. We sell this part number, it's 142519-IA, and it also includes this positive wire that goes to your battery itself. Ground wire actually is built into the harness right here. That pretty much sums up the connections right here. Again, if you have the later P200, the connections are slightly different in a regulator, but for the most part, they're the same. And the European bikes, sometimes they have a regulator that's 3 terminals. I think they have blue and black. And then some of the electric start bikes have even another variation of the voltage regulator with different connections. On the PX, quite a bit different. We don't see too many of those here in the States because they stopped selling these in 1981. But the PXs actually have a lot of connectors that are used on it, so or on, you know, different various parts of the harness. That about sums it up for the wiring. Again, these are your tail and brake wiring. We haven't drilled the hole yet, but eventually I'll get to those. Normally you got blue. On this wiring harness is white, but it's normally gray in some cases, and then black is your ground. And we'll get to that whenever we put the tail light on.
All right, Shaka Brada. We're gonna go give you some pointers about installing the floor rails on this Vespa. A decent flat file is always good. What I like to do is I'll kind of dress the ends of them to make sure there's no sharp edges, because as these things are moving around, last thing you want to have happen is one of those edges to scuff the paint unnecessarily. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of dry fitting these things, curving them into shape, drilling them, making them nice and neat, so when it comes back from the paint, they're easy to install. So you kind of want to clean up the ends of that. I'll take another further safety step, and you see I've got a little bit of yellow masking tape. at the ends of the rails. That's just to kind of protect the paint, so when these things kind of move around. And you'll notice I've already got these ones started with some pop rivets. We use an 1/8 inch pop rivet. We've got a couple different lengths. I definitely recommend using an aluminum one over a steel one. We're kind of using what we've got. And anytime you use pop rivets, you want to use a backup washer. And they're a special rivet backup washer. See how thick that thing is? And it's a nice tight inner circle. So when that rivet starts to expand, it doesn't pull through. So I've already got it started. My technique is I'll usually set all the rivets in so it aligns the thing perfectly. And you want to take your rivet gun. I've already got this one loosely started. You reach around underneath there, put the backup washer on it. And again, like I said early on, I like doing this seated, so you've got total control. And all I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just barely start the rivet. So all I'm doing is just barely pulling it in so that washer doesn't fall off. And I'm doing that so I still have the flexibility to adjust this rail forward and back as needed. I cheated and already did the first one. And here again, my technique, because the throw is so large on most rivet guns, I'm using my leg to kind of get it started. Definitely a bit of feel when it comes to using a rivet gun, but pretty simple, straightforward. So with that started, you just want to make sure that you're perfectly aligned on these end holes, because you only have so much wiggle room there. So that's that one. I'm going to go ahead and start from scratch with this next one. And again, obviously these rails are specific. They'll only go in one, each one of them will only go in one spot. So take the rivet, loosely lined up, push the rivet in, do the same thing up here, kind of push the rivet in. Sometimes you have to wiggle it around a little bit. A lot of times too, I'll take the rivet gun and actually just push it in. You always feel it when it seats. And go ahead and put that backup washer on there and start to compress it just to hold it in place, and then repeat. What I usually will do is actually get all the rails in about the same spot. So I'll go ahead and get the outer one in, and we'll come back in and show you where we're at. All right, so we've got all of our pop rivets started. We've got backup washers already on them, and they're just kind of loosely started to pull through. I didn't mention this in the intro, but pop rivets aren't really the original way to hold these down, but they certainly are an effective and fast way to actually install these things going forward. So what we do is do pop rivets on the inner holes, and on the outer holes we use original P200 rivets, and we'll get to that shortly. One bit of info, like we talked about with the pop rivet gun, is I use my leg as a fulcrum, so I'm prying against my leg, and I always use my left hand to kind of hold the head of the rivet gun. So when the rivet snaps, this thing doesn't shoot up, and trust me, I know this from experience. I've had them where the rivet snaps off and this thing slips, and you put a big scrape in the paint. So we want to make sure we don't do that. So you just kind of squeeze that thing down, and that's the sound. It's definitely nice to use a good quality rivet gun. This is a nice Matco one, and it definitely does make a big difference. So I'll get them all at this point and then kind of quickly go assembly line and actually unsnap all of them. So I'll keep doing this, and then we'll come back and show you the next step. All right, so we're moving on to the next step. We've got all the pop rivets fully depressed, and we're going to move on to the installing the end pieces on the P series, or this black plastic one with a through hole. And there's a special P200 style of rivet that you're supposed to use from the factory. You'll notice even with these other rivets installed, we've still got a decent amount of play up here, so we can still, let's let John get around there. You can still wiggle these around so it lines up nicely. And these holes are actually larger than the other holes. These are like about a 3/16 hole, whereas remember these ones were 1/8 inch holes. So what I'll do is I'll have a pretty clean 3/16 bit, and I'll actually clean up those holes, but I'll clean up, from this direction, so as to like not push and crack paint outward. So I got robot ready to go. Another thing too, we covered this in another video, but we've got a special like sacrificial punch set in a block of wood where that's kind of domed out to match the head of that rivet, so we can kind of put good downward pressure as we peen this over. And again, as we peen this over, we're going to use a trusty ball peen hammer. That's what those are made for. So you'll see as we kind of tap the rivet down. So we're going to get set up. John's going to walk back around, and we'll see how this goes. Do it in real time. So everything lines up really good from there. You notice the rivet is excessively long. Nice pair of sharp dikes. You want to carefully cut that thing, I don't know, maybe that's 3/16 of an inch beyond the floorboard. You'll cut that off. Robot's putting good downward pressure on it. That's a little on the long side, but it'll be okay. See how it pinches that together? That's gonna be very tough to peen over. So we're gonna use our trusty file. We're gonna very carefully, obviously we don't wanna nick the frame or anything. We're gonna file flat. So we've got a good starting point for our ball peen hammer. And also too, in this case, like I said, I ran it a little bit longer than I really wanted. So just kind of filing that flat. Being careful not to touch the frame and ruin our paint job. Robot's still putting good downward pressure on it, and that's about how you want it to look. Now we're going to take our ball peen hammer, and I'm going to have to reposition the frame a little. I'm going to spin it, so extend it over our workbench here. And basically I'll choke up on the hammer really good. If you're really nervous, you can actually put a couple layers of masking tape around it. Really don't need to, as long as you're just kind of careful as you tap it down. Got to tap for a while. Let me turn the mic on. Mic's on now. Tap for a while until this basically mushrooms all the way flat. Again, my technique, choking up, short little taps. Robot's putting constant downward pressure. And you really want to make sure that you hammer these things all the way down so those end pieces don't, wiggle around and vibrate and work their way loose. Oh, that's good. So we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so we moved on to the outer one. The outer one's the exact same as the inner ones. One thing I wanted to show on the outer one is you notice we actually drilled the hole through the actual leg shield beading. That's the way it's supposed to be. So the outermost one is definitely the trickiest of all of them because you're basically going through the leg shield beading on the inside and the outside, through the actual steel leg shield, through the aluminum channel, and then into the end piece. So we got everything aligned, Robot's holding it down, and it's just going to peen it over in the exact same fashion. The next thing is actually going to be to go in and install the rubber in the channel. On the P bikes, it's pretty easy. You can tend to actually slide it in pretty easily. On some of the bikes, like the 60s and 70s bikes, where it's that other style of rubber, a lot of times you have to kind of set one side and then carefully with like a plastic tip screwdriver or something like that, push the thing in. Not the case with this. You'll see how easy this is, and I swear there's not magic. But we'll kind of use like a little purple, diluted like purple power degreaser, anything to really kind of act as a lubricant as this thing kind of slides in. You can actually use the top of your hands nice and dry for the friction against the rubber and kind of just push down on the thing and guide it in place. And again, Robot's here, so I'll kind of push the back and he'll kind of work the front end.
Send a little racetrack, send the rubber down the racetrack.
And normally too, if you buy one of the kits, this rubber is going to be in one spool, so you'll have to kind of set the one end and pull it back and forth and cut it to the right length. But these are actually original rubbers, so again, we're kind of lucking out with the ease of this particular restoration. Then we're going to just do the same thing on the back caps as we did in the front. Make sure everything lines up, pass the drill bit through, peen them over, and that's pretty much it. I'll go ahead and just show you what it's going to look like from the underside, and we'll just call it a day. I'm going to try and not knock those rivets over again. But again, this is why I like to have the bike on its, not have the engine in it to be doing this now. So now what we can kind of do is we can hold that through and peen this over very comfortably, like so. But you can kind of see the pop rivets with the backup washers and all those locations. You never see underneath there, but the grand scheme of it actually looks pretty clean. This is another good thing to do while we've got the frame still able to put on its side. This is putting the rear brake pedal inside the frame. You'll notice actually we've got masking tape protecting the through hole. That's because you kind of have to shoehorn the actual part you put your foot on of the brake pedal. You have to kind of shoehorn that through. And if you don't put some sort of masking tape, it's very easy to kind of chip the paint down there by the floor. We don't want to do that. So we've got a new rubber seated on there. Robot's got the switch hooked up. He's greased all the lubrication points. It's very common too that these things actually get completely seized up and rusted. So it's a good idea to actually disassemble the pedal completely, clean up this pivot pin here, pack it with fresh grease, because this is kind of your one chance to do that.
If you drive it out actually from this direction, right where the two holes, it won't drive out this way, it goes out this direction. Actually, the bolt on this side kind of traps that pin from wanting to pop out. And I'll tell you, some of them are quite seized up. You got to heat this up if they're...
Yeah, we've had them where you almost have to get those. I mean, aluminum doesn't get glowing red, but You have to get them so hot to hit that pin out.
Yeah, basically cables in there. There's a little cotter pin, the two electrical connections. You know, make
Electrical
sure.
connections, it doesn't matter which wire goes to which side, so they're non-side specific. We'll see if we can get this nice and lucky. So you see, kind of tilts that at an angle.
And sometimes you could pull that cable out there. You know, that makes it a little easier. So basically, rock that through, and then you need to actually get the rear of this in the hole. See right here, this actually has to go in next. So once that gets in, then you can actually easily slide that in.
And again, imagine trying to do this with the frame right side up and you're kind of laying on your back or reaching under there. This is definitely the time to do it. We've got two 6mm by about 20, 6mm by 20mm long bolts. From the factory, they don't come with a washer on the top side. Robot and I both are in agreement that the washer actually kind of cleans stuff up. So I'm going to go ahead and push these through. Robot's going to thread.
I'll put another flat washer, which you don't necessarily need, but I'll do it, and a lock washer. Put the nut. If you want to get a little tweaky with it, you can actually put a nylock nut on it. But the new lock washer will hold it just fine. I've off-roaded the crap out of these scooters and never had any need for the nylock nut. So
There you go. I just turned my mic back on. I always forget that.
oops. And also, when you're tightening these, obviously you want to hold the ones on the top stationary and tighten it from the bottom. You don't want to be sitting there turning the bolt and scraping up your brand new paint job.
So we'll go ahead and finish tightening that, and that's installing the rear brake pedal. The final thing we'll do, or the thing we'll do next, is actually put the center stand on. And again, it's nice to be able to do that where we can turn the front frame upside down. So next thing will be us putting the center stand on. So we got the frame flipped completely upside down. Makes putting the stand on pretty easy. You got to be kind of careful. The frame will teeter a little, but since Robot and I are both on it, pretty simple, or pretty easy for us to kind of maintain. There's these hardened steel clips on the P series that act as a buffer between the frame and the stand, so it keeps the stand from like wearing out the frame. Those are actually pretty critical, and that's where those actually go. Robot's got a new rubber installed in the stand and new boots, ready to go, right? Mm-hmm. And we've applied a layer of grease also to the friction points on the stand here.
This is your left-hand side thing, and this little thing is where the actual little rubber buffer actually kind of stops on.
And these are definitely side specific, so they'll really only go one way and line up correctly. And that's
everything's pretty good. And then again, just like the brake pedal, like a M6 by 20 and a flat washer.
And one thing you'll actually notice is the longer part of the frame comes this way. And that's because when the stand comes up, these brackets actually rest on the back part of the stick steel. So that keeps from putting pressure on the stand. So Robot's feeding the washers up through from the underside.
Flat washer, split washer. And actually I'm going to use nylocks on the center stands. Because sometimes if, especially a powder coated center stand, if you tighten these too tight, it will cause the center stand to bind. And with the nylock nut, you can actually back it off, but it's not likely to fall off. If you have the nut a little looser to allow the stand to turn freely.
So again, and much like the brake pedal, I'm going to hold a wrench on the underside, and Robot's actually going to be tightening it from the top side.
All right, we're going to go ahead and put the spring on. Both these nuts, all four nuts are pretty tight. I backed them off just a little bit, so this has kind of got it.
Oh, actually, let's show this little S-hook thing.
Oh, yeah.
That's what the spring attaches to, a little flat piece of curved steel, and it fits in those special slots there. Yeah. Spring puller tool. Robot and I are just Eiffel Tower in this frame right now. That's pretty much it. Yeah!